Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today, as the title suggests, we're going to be talking a little bit about best practices for onboarding hourly staff. Today, I am joined back with Laura Timbrook. Laura, thank you so much for coming back. I love seeing you on.
Oh, thank you for having me. These are always great.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'm excited for, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. So everyone be sure to hang in there with that. Laura is a national board certified health and wellness coach, international speaker who works with manufacturing and other shift work industries. She works with individuals and organizations to create a plan that fits their health and wellness goals and can be heard each week on her podcast, Outspoken Nutrition, where she breaks down health and wellness advice so her listeners can decide what works best for them. Guys, I highly recommend checking that out. It is an awesome, awesome resource. Hello, everybody. So Pamela has already gotten very used to the chat box. Pamela, yes, to answer your question very quickly, HRCI and SHRM credits will be given at the very end if you're watching this live, which I'm happy to see that there's a lot of faces in the audience. To get everyone else acquainted, usually I like to ask a question like, where's everyone dialing in from? What is everyone looking forward to for the fall? For today's topic, I would love for any show recommendations, any TV show recommendations. I'm kind of in a lull right now, so I would love to hear anything that you guys have to share on something you've really enjoyed. Throw it in the chat box. I would love to hear from you guys. The chat box is also a great place to throw in any questions you have throughout the webinar. Please use that to your advantage. We'll have a Q&A at the very end, the last 10, 15 minutes or so, just depending on where we're at. So be sure to throw in any of those questions there. Awesome. Elizabeth, thank you so much. I'm a silo. Okay, I haven't heard of that. Suits, the bear. I loved the bear. I loved the bear, Cindy. Awesome. Guys, please keep throwing in those suggestions. I love it. I'm going to have to sort through these later. Okay. Poll questions. We have a couple of those today as well. Those are going to be sliding out right on the bottom left of your screen. Guys, I'm obsessed with these options right now. I'm so excited. We are going to have 3 of those throughout the webinar. Be sure to interact with those poll questions. They are a really good way for us to kind of get a sense of where your heads are at and, talk with you guys about it. And then we do have an awesome handout from Laura herself. We have 10 tips for fostering employee well-being and engagement. I will hand out that PDF at the very end of the webinar. So again, just be sure to hang in there. Angela at the morning show, that is on my list of things to watch. That is for sure. And again, just to readdress the SHRM and HRCI credits, we will be handing those out at the very, very end of the webinar. Again, those are just for those who are live in the audience. So for those of you who are throwing in the show suggestions, you guys will be getting those at the very end. And to give a little background on workforce.com, we are an HCM software company that specializes for businesses with hourly staff. And we throw these webinars really just as a way to engage with you all, to share our own findings from our own client base, and to see where everyone's heads are at. Awesome. Okay, Laura, thank you so much for being patient with me. Go through all of that. You're I've seen it before. I would love for you to tell me about your experience with hourly wage businesses first and foremost.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hourly wage businesses, it's such a different dichotomy than corporate, and I came into this as kind of a corporate health and wellness. So when I started going to areas where they had hourly waged employees or, maybe they were shift work, it became so glaringly different that what we see in corporate is totally different than what we see in the hourly waged employees. And it's interesting. And I'm so excited to talk about the onboarding because this is hugely different. And a lot of times, unfortunately, the people that design the onboarding are in the corporate office. And a lot of times our hourly waged employees, whether they're plant production, retail, transportation, it's so much different, the experience for them. And a lot of times we're not making those connections. So this is a great topic to have.
We were just talking about before how onboarding currently is really rearing its head, so to speak, right? There's been a lot of nuances, a lot of issues going on within the HR space, within managers, even operationally, where onboarding is really hard to nail down, specifically for shift-based or hourly wage industries. So we'll definitely be going more into that later. Laura, how has onboarding changed over the past couple of years, would you say, specifically since COVID? Because I think that really kind of drove a wrench in things, so to speak.
I think we had to go so fast from in person to online. And, we really did try to handle it as best as we could.
Sure.
But not all organizations already had a remote staff setup. So trying to integrate that and then trying to integrate that with employees that have to be in a facility was
Yeah.
really difficult. So you didn't have the touch, the touch points, the connections. It became literally, like you said, the Wild West. It was
Yes.
just onboarding became almost, I don't want to say hysterics, but it was almost like pure chaos.
Yeah.
It was just like, who did
Absolutely
what?
chaotic.
Yeah, and it was
Mhm.
just, I think now we're starting to kind of bring it back around, but even just taking a step back from COVID, even let's go back 10 years. Onboarding used to all be paperwork. You
Mhm.
would have your employee handbook, you would have
Yeah.
all your paperwork. A lot of times you were sitting in the HR office.
Yeah.
All of that is totally different. And I think we're just catching up. And I think that's why it's been such a big thing, because we're entering such a different technology phase and
Mhm.
we're just trying to play catch up.
It's funny to think that something like writing something on a piece of paper in an office space is outdated, right? It's so, I mean, it's fast moving how technology is inserting itself, and again, just yeah, inserting itself within specifically onboarding. It's crazy. And to have something like writing down on a piece of paper, what all the onboarding forms will be, it is, yeah, it's beyond, it's crazy. All right. So, in terms of trends, what do you anticipate in some of the years to come for onboarding related trends?
I think we're going to see it all just be really compressed into a system.
Mm,
It's going to be systems. I mean, we're seeing it already with, workforce.com. They have their own all in one system.
yep.
We see it ADP. We see so many of these systems that now they're not just pay systems, they're not just time tracking system. We're putting it all together, which makes life so much easier
Sure.
if it's done correctly, right?
Yep.
Because we can have software be streamlined, and then as organizations, we can really kind of mess it up a bit.
Mhm.
So I think really getting that streamlined, and I think if we can reduce the onboarding and really putting the critical parts, we see trends now where it's not, in retail, it used to be like weeks on like a week solid on a computer doing trainings.
Yeah.
Now we're compressing it, we're stretching it out. So I think that's going to keep changing, and it's going to be different for every industry.
hmm Yeah, and we actually got a really awesome emailed in question. Hopefully, we'll get to that at the very end during the Q&A section, where this person talks a lot about what timeline looks like for onboarding and how to know when it's actually appropriate versus when it's too long versus when it's too short. So we'll be going into all that later. What are some, the more common mistakes that you're seeing HR come across when it comes to onboarding?
I think it's engagement. It's engagement
Yeah.
with the managers, it's engagement with the employee.
Mm,
It's changed. A lot of times I feel like HR had a lot more connection points
yep.
to the employees as they were onboarding. Now it's very much systematic.
hmm
And even to the point where their frontline managers aren't even having the connection points. Everything's so busy. We're all short staffed. It's becoming very difficult. And I think that's some of the things that we need to start bringing back is that communication. I mean, if those of you that have been on the webinars with me before, communication is key. And I think
Absolutely.
one of the other things we're going to see a lot, and what I want to see, is mentorships. I think that's huge when we start saying, how are we going to do all this? Let the employees help us out.
hmm And I think it's knowing when and where technology comes into play and having that human, that person centric approach that HR brings in addition to technology, having it kind of go hand in hand opposed to technology completely leading the way, just handing it off to technology. I think that there is such a time and a place for technology to insert itself, specifically in the onboarding process, like automating paperwork and organizing everything so it's easy for you. And that's, exactly as Laura said, what Workforce does. But I think it's also important to have that person approach to it, have a mentor there, have the manager guide you around and take them from, person to person, introducing them to the team. And I think that's so, so crucial. I want to point to this very first slide that we've got here. So my question for you, Laura, looking at this 7 tips to take into account when onboarding new employees, what are some, key elements or even steps that are absolutely essential to creating an onboarding experience for hourly staff, like for, and we're talking industries that have that high turnover rate. So what are those elements that you would suggest here?
Yeah. The first one, write a welcome card. From the employee wellness, well-being perspective, this is probably one of the biggest trends we're starting to see is gratitude.
Sure.
That makes such a big difference. We all say about, that first impression. You can't change a first impression. And when I talk to a lot of folks, they say, a lot of them will remember their first day of work. They won't remember the first week of work. They might not even remember the first 10 years, but they remember the first day. So being able to have a handwritten welcome card, not something generated from a system, but a handwritten welcome card speaks volumes to the organization.
Yeah.
Then the other thing you have in here, and I would kind of call it a mentor, is the onboarding buddy. Just someone to say, one of the crazy things, I was just talking to an employee, they were just starting at a retail location, and they said they actually didn't know when they got paid, like what day they get paid. And that to me was like, that should have been number one. Where's my money, right? You're working because you want money. Where is it? And the fact that they didn't know that and it wasn't upfront, that kind of concerned me a little bit because that's a huge thing. So having that onboarding buddy that can just answer all these nuanced questions that seem just kind of minute to everybody else, but to the employee, it's huge.
For sure. I think that's such a good point. So in terms of tools that you found effective, what are some of those tools? Like what does that look like for hiring, hourly staff and having them understand their roles to a T? What are some tools that you use in your tool belt?
When it comes to stuff like that, I think there's so many applications out there that do a great job. The problem is half the time we're not utilizing them.
Yeah.
So I think we need to, whatever system you're currently working in, work within your system. But then also too, going back to that mentor or even going back to the old school ways of checklists, a lot of times we know that our new employees have to do 5 critical tasks before we could put them on the floor. But they might have 40 trainings they actually have to go through within maybe the first 30 days. Let's get those 5 critical tasks out of the way and get them moving because that's going to be key. So it's really about utilizing what we have, the mentorship, the buddy, and having them know if they don't have a mentorship, if they don't have a buddy, do they have a direct line to HR? Do they have something that they can get the questions answered? Because not all the time it's about knowing where things are. It's about how fast you can find them. And I think that's kind of key when we're onboarding.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It actually leads me perfectly to my next question. What are some examples of successful onboarding programs that actually have resulted in improved retention, and even performance of these hourly staff?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to mentorship because as soon as we buddy people up and we show them that there's a path forward, they give them the assistance, that's huge. And it doesn't even have to be a big mentorship. It doesn't have to be something long drawn out. Maybe for the first week, you buddy them up, you schedule them with another coworker to kind of go through the motions of things. And again, it's going to depend on the industry and what's going on and how that's going to work. But a lot of times I see we get these employees in, we get the legal paperwork out of the way, and then we just throw them on the floor. And it's a sink or swim scenario. If you're in the sink or swim scenario as an employee, this is not going to make you feel good about your job. It's not going to make you feel good about yourself, and it's not going to make you feel good about the organization. We have to remember employees don't leave bad jobs. They leave bad management. So if they don't feel supported, that's going to be key. So that's one of the biggest things. The next thing is really kind of streamlining that onboarding. What is critical?
Hmm.
How can we get them moving forward? People don't want to be spending 40, 60 hours staring at a computer screen going through monotone trainings.
Hmm.
We need to get them up and running. And then maybe they spend an hour or two a day going through the trainings. But we got to streamline this a little bit better.
I think that there's also something we said when it comes to the onboarding buddy, that it really delegates, it actually takes some workload off from the managers who are already dealing with a lot. We actually talked a little bit last week on a webinar on managing managers, right? We're seeing that managers aren't actually given the right tools to be able to perform. So let's take off some of that workload. Onboarding is a really big part of that, where they're the ones who often are assigned as the new hires onboarding buddy. I think that's great. If the managers have time for that, I think that's awesome. But in reality, I think assigning someone who is even equal to their peer to this new hire starting role, who has maybe even been with the company for even a couple months, a couple weeks, I think that's very acceptable. And it takes out from that, training on a computer, let's say, if that's the case, if that's what the onboarding program looks like, it really takes that away. And instead, it's way more engaging. I think studies have actually shown that hands-on approach, hands-on training is actually shown to retain more employees and actually have a better success rate for loyalty in the long term. So I think it's just all about, delegating out from managers a little bit here. I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah, and what you said too, it doesn't have to be somebody that's been there necessarily a long time.
Mhm.
Somebody, if you have somebody that maybe just onboarded 3 months ago,
Yeah.
2 months ago, depending on their skill level and how they are and things like that, that can be super helpful because they just went through the process. They
Yes.
know what questions they're looking for. And I see Heidi asked the question about, sometimes a lot of training and supporting those mentors is needed too. Yes, but I think a lot of times we need to already look at what employees we have that we can trust. And I think a lot of times it's trying to pick out those qualities, and it's really allowing the managers, giving them the knowledge of, okay, how to spot a good employee, how to spot somebody. A lot of times I walk into organizations and there's already this person doing it. They're
Yeah.
just not recognized for it. But I do think we need to incentivize it a little bit and offer some additional training, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so tight on the training, so rigorous. Sometimes if we give more leeway, it's a little bit easier.
Yeah. And Heidi, yeah, exactly. I think that's really a good point. And supporting those mentors is exactly kind of what I was alluding to with, managing managers, right? And not micromanaging by any means, but actually just giving them tools to actually help support in the long term. Nancy says our company uses texting technology to check in on new hires 30, 60, 90 days. I've heard a lot of awesome success with 30, 60, 90-day check-ins. Laura, I'm actually curious, what are your thoughts on that?
I love it.
Yeah.
Anytime we can increase communication,
Yeah.
this is huge. And I even like it when it's not only the same person. I saw an organization, the first 30 days, they're dealing with the direct managers. Then at 90 days, a general manager or a director comes in.
Yes.
And this is really interesting because this now allows open conversation, open communication, that if something is getting a little clunky with the onboarding, or maybe the
Mhm.
manager isn't as responsive as they would like to see, this gives that open communication. And I think this is really important, is that we are having open communications across all levels.
Absolutely. So what makes a strong onboarding program actually stand out, would you say?
Communication. I
Yeah.
think that's the biggest thing. If we're communicating, if we're touching base, no new employee wants to feel like a burden. And
Mhm.
oftentimes when I talk to employees, that's the sense I'm getting, that the new employees, I don't want to bother them. I don't want to burden them,
Yes.
but we can't be a burden. It's funny, years ago we used to be giving that the employee handbook.
Mm.
We don't do that anymore. It is buried somewhere
Yep.
online that we don't even know it is. I'm going to challenge kind of people here. I want you to ask 3 or 4 employees if they know where their employee handbook is,
Yeah.
because they don't know where it is. And a lot of times they're quick signing off on something because they have a bigger task to do. But yet HR spends a ton of time and money writing these safety protocols
Sure.
and putting this all together. We need to be aware of where that is, because half of the questions that new employees might have and need to ask,
Mhm.
it's in the employee handbook. We just don't know where it is.
I would actually love to piggyback off that. We just released one of our products, and it's employee handbook right in the employee mobile app, and it's able to have a PDF version, an online version of the employee handbook from your company right in the employee app for workforce.com, and it is huge. And we've actually heard some really awesome feedback from our clients, and they that HR themselves didn't even know where their own employee handbook was.
Mhm.
And now they're like, it's great because I'm able to not only delegate to the handbook itself, but I know they have it on them because it's on their phone.
Mhm.
And that's been huge. And that's something that's actually been a huge help for a lot of customers. So kind of feeds me into my next question for you, Laura. In your experience, what role does technology actually play in streamlining the onboarding process for hourly staff?
I'm going to say, I'm going to put it around 60%. I think
Yeah,
technology, it has this amazing power to streamline things, but it
absolutely.
also needs that human connection. So, as much as our onboarding policy can present us with the documents we need to sign, present us with the training we need to take,
Mhm.
it's really having that manager or mentor or buddy or whoever it is, somebody check in along the line. So, while technology plays a huge role, I think it's just a little bit more than half, because
Yeah.
really we need those human touch points, because that's going to be what makes or breaks things. And you know it's difficult onboarding, especially considering what kind of industry you're going on. I've seen really good onboardings and I've seen really bad onboarding.
Yeah. I actually was just I was talking to one of our clients over at Streets Team Enterprises, and I'm sure for those who have come on the webinars, you've heard me talk about them. They're awesome. They're actually a nonprofit organization that works with homeless people who are homeless and need a job, and they actually assign them roles within their community. And it's really hard to, this is definitely an older demographic too. It's really hard to get an older demographic. Most of them don't even have cell phones to their names to get onboarded with technology. And that's where Tawny, who was the HR generalist over at Streets Team, I was talking to her and she was like, having the mobile app was actually really huge, and as well as a desktop version, and having them being able to streamline all the forms and get them acquainted. And the interface was really simple for Workforce. They were able to adapt on it really quickly and learn how it works super fast. But she took it from there, right? She was able to get all the information from them. She was able to organize it within Workforce. And then she was able to actually spend her time being their, onboarding buddy, essentially, showing them around, getting them acquainted, getting them comfortable more than anything, right? And I think that's really important too. So yeah, I think the 60% is a huge, huge number, honestly, for technology, even in that sense, where it's more than half, right? And I think that other 40% is that person-centric approach that we were talking about. It's huge. Also, Emma, I do love what you said in the chat as well. She said at 30 days, a new hire meets with our director, HR, and then our senior manager of the systems. At 60 days and then 90 days, they meet with our senior manager or learning and development. Each is a 30-minute designated meeting. And I think that feeds really well into point number 6 on this slide. Host a short new hire orientation. Even if it's broken up, I don't think that orientation should necessarily take a day or two, right? I think that's way too long, especially within hourly wage industries where, turnover is already high. We already need to get them up and running realistically. Usually these new hires are backfilling a position in today's day and age. We need to get them hitting the ground running. So having something like a 30, 60, 90-day check-in to consistently communicate and check in with them over a 90-day period of time. In this case, sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. It's huge. It's really important. So, Laura, my question for you is many organizations struggle with balancing compliance, obviously, and engagement within their onboarding process. So, how can companies strike the right balance to ensure hourly employees not only meet these regulatory requirements, but also feel engaged and motivated from day number one?
Yeah, that's the always difficult, right?
Mm,
Because a lot of this, when we're dealing with compliance, I know a lot of what I deal with, it's OSHA related, and
yeah.
OSHA is not fun. None of the trainings are fun. It's
Nope.
very monotonous, but a
Yeah.
lot of times you have to go through the OSHA training before you can get on the floor.
Mhm.
So it's really important, and I think that's where, as a manager, we need to set the standard that, listen, we have to go through these OSHA trainings or whatever regulatory agency it is, but really kind of breaking it up. Maybe you come in, maybe they do an hour with it, and then you come in and, even if you just have a chat with them for 5 minutes,
Yeah.
just somehow break it up so it just doesn't feel like, well, my first day, they just stuffed me in front of a computer in the back of a dark room and kind of left me there.
Right.
Because yeah, a lot of these compliance trainings, they're very monotonous. They're very, they're difficult to go through, and
For
it doesn't
sure.
set a good stage. So if you can kind of make it a little bit funner, um, it makes it a little bit easier. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, we got to get the work done for them because that's what's
Yeah.
required.
Yeah, and I think again, this is one of those things, and I shouldn't say to gloss over this kind of stuff. Compliance is very, very important for a multitude of reasons, right? And we need to make sure that we're staying compliant in every aspect. But at the same time, I don't think that sitting a new hire down for 3 hours, talking to them about the compliance protocols, I think that's going to go right
Mhm.
over their head, right? I don't think that it's going to go anywhere. I don't think it's going to be retained information. I don't think it's going to be long lasting to this new hire who's just there for, learning the new skills that they're going to be learning, right? And Laura, we actually talked about this new skill development. And who knows, maybe compliance is something that they want to learn more about, and that's great. But I think a lot of it can actually be delegated to managers, to the employee handbook, someone who is specific to compliance protocols who can actually sit them down for 30 minutes or so and say, hey, this is what you need to know, you know, come to me if you have any questions, that sort of thing. And I think that's really important.
And I think too, to add to that, we need to really kind of look at, what do they need day one?
Sure.
Are we going through compliance trainings because there is, let's say, a cardboard crusher, like the
Yeah.
box crushers, and they need to know from the OSHA end how to safely operate it, but yet they're working the cashier, they're the register. Do
Yeah.
they really need that day one? Like, what do we really need day one? And I think taking a look at that is important as well.
Absolutely. I want to dive back into communication tools, what kind of, what those look like, for example. So, looking at this next slide, assessing your onboarding materials, I think that this is really important and talking about revisiting some of the old communication tools that you actually already have. I realized that these screenshots, I actually snagged these from an awesome, awesome LinkedIn thread that I found on what's your approach to keeping training materials updated. And two answers actually really stuck out to me. I underlined this one from Ronald on the left. We use a method of having a new person in the department go through our procedure modules pretty much every time. Every time we add a new employee. If the new employee can't complete the given task, then the person that updates the module will go into it and update it with the new employee. Our procedures stay updated much more than before we started this practice. Rashmi said they have two top strategies over at her company. One, they set up regular review and schedule for training materials and ensure that they are up to date. And two, engage SMEs with your organization or industry to review and contribute to the training materials. Laura, first and foremost, what are your thoughts on these two approaches and keeping your materials, your communication practices, and onboarding procedures updated?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Ronald said,
Yeah.
because when we're dealing with technology, technology moves so fast, our trainings go so fast, so we need to be updating them on the fly consistently. And if, who knows, maybe a new update came in on one of your systems and no one remembered to update it on the employee, directions and things like that. So this is really important, and I love that he's doing.
Hmm.
I like that they're engaging the SMEs with Rashimi, but the one thing I would say with this is, a lot of times SMEs, lose touch to what's actually happening in the real world.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see
So
that.
I love what they're saying, but I would like to kind of put somebody that's on the floor in there with that SME and
Mhm.
make sure that the two are meeting, because there's a difference between what the system should be doing and how it's used in real life. So, I love that. And, I'm going to go back to Emma's comment about having that training, sitting down with the senior manager and the learning and development.
Absolutely.
That is probably one of the best things I have heard of, and I love whatever organization, Emma, you're doing. This is great, because this is one of the biggest pain points we see, is that we get these trainings in and it doesn't reflect what real life is, and it becomes
Yeah.
very difficult.
I think to take both of these, Ronald and Rishmi's anecdotes into account, what I like about Rishmi's is it's all about delegating, right? That's kind of my theme, I guess, of today. I think delegation is really key when it comes to onboarding. And I think that using an SME is good for outsourcing that kind of work. But I do agree that sometimes it's really hard to paint the picture to an SME group where, they're not necessarily coming in literally from the front lines, where Ronald, his team is actually a practitioner. His employees are practitioners of their own onboarding program, of their own product that they're making here. So I think that's really key for, not only making sure that it's seamless and streamlined, but also making sure that it makes sense to the role, right? And these roles, especially within shift-based industries, are really different. There's something to be said about keeping a small workforce and making sure that everybody has their part, and you're not necessarily working overtime because we want to keep labor costs low, but everybody has their role, right? So each of these roles are very different because everybody has their own responsibilities. So Laura, my question for you is, so with industries with multiple shifts and evolving jobs and responsibilities, how can HR ensure that training content remains up to date and adaptable?
We need to be talking to the shift leaders
Yeah.
when we're dealing with shifts. I mean,
Yes.
the processes for a daytime shift and the processes for a nighttime shift are going to be drastically different. And I see this a lot because shift work is where I spend most of my time.
Mm,
And the crazy thing is when we do this, a lot of times, like the leaders will be like, "Oh, don't worry about that. That doesn't relate to us. Don't worry about that. That doesn't relate to us." And a lot of times nighttime employees always feel like they're just kind of like the black sheeps of the crew, right?
yeah.
And when our training reflects that thought process, that's where it's really, so we really, years ago in corporate, we used to have teams. There was always like a team for this, a team for that. And I think, over the years, we kind of got away from these teams because then everyone became so siloed. I think we need to go back to bringing these teams back together, and having these teams day shift, night shift is really important.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Also, Melissa, I see you might have lost internet. If anyone has any technical issues, I think the best way, and it sounds so basic, just reload the page. Always that seems to help for the most part. So let me know if that helps in any sense. Laura, my question in terms of, training programs for, again, these different shifts, are there any examples of any organizations that you might have worked with that have actually successfully implemented standardized training programs?
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to mentorship. I
Yeah.
mean, mentorship, especially when we're dealing with shifts, is huge, because a lot of times, unless you're dealing with a rotating shift, so the day shift understands the night shift and the night shift understands the day shift,
Hmm.
unless you're dealing in that kind of industry, they are two separate organizations. And, kind of the crazy thing is we see this too, even within large multi-site regions, that, it's what happens in the Northeast might not be what's happening in the West Coast. And
Right.
it's very different. So I think really when we're talking about, bringing this together and understanding, having that mentor, that buddy that can kind of go through all this, because I think it's going to be very hard on, you know, uh, the technology end to reflect this without being cumbersome or very confusing. And I think that's where, we can probably do a little bit better, because the people that are going to know are the people that are doing it. And I think that's where we have to delegate and lean on to some of that, and understanding that, some things are going to have to change based on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think coming from our end, the workforce end, where technology is very much utilized. I think things like the pulse survey feature is actually really big to be able to kind of get a gauge on what your program needs more of, and having a pulse survey sent to employees and to new hires after, depending on how often you want to send them, every shift we've seen every 2 weeks, every month, having those pulse surveys and seeing, asking the right questions, saying, what did you think of your 30-day check-in today? What do you think of your 60-day check-in, whatever it might be? And knowing that the feedback that you can garner from that is actually going to be huge for actually re-implementing that into your onboarding program, into your standardized training, right? And making sure that, hey, this is something that we need more of because we've been hearing these from our own frontline staff. It's kind of taking in Ronald's perspective from this LinkedIn post, right? Where they actually are a practitioner. They're actually going through it with their new employee together as a team, as an HR department, and making sure, hey, are they going through this as smoothly as possible? If so, or if not, what is the feedback that we can garner from them? And I think pulse surveying is absolutely huge. And it's a feature that I know a ton of our clients love and are obsessed with, in terms of being able to regularly and automatically send out those surveys and actually have that feedback in their own back pocket for HR. I think that's huge. And using that feedback, I think that's really the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
We see a lot of times people sending out these surveys and they're great. They're great questions. They're really getting good feedback, actually, for the most part. In fact, response rates are way higher than they have ever been when they use Workforce, but it's something that they don't necessarily apply it to their programs. And I think that's really important to note. So it's what you make of it. That's the 40%, right? It's using technology for that 60%. And then that 40% is actually applying it. And that's where the person-centric approach comes in.
Yeah. And I'm going to kind of piggyback off of that for a second, because I love the idea of polls and surveys.
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up, we have to utilize it. The employee needs to know that the time they're spending on that survey matters. But I'm going to add 2 other points to that. The first one is be very careful on, are they logging in? Because I know a lot of times we say, oh, they're completely anonymous, yet they ask you to log in. So I know a lot of employees, they will say, as soon as a survey comes in and requires me to log in, I won't do it.
Yeah.
Because to them, it means it's not anonymous. Somewhere you may or may not be tracking. So that's one thing to be wary of. And the second one is, how much are you asking for them? The shorter we can keep the surveys, the better. So we have to build trust with the surveys. The employees need to know that this is not going to come back to them, because I've heard it too many times, especially with hourly waged employees. They feel like surveys have affected their employment. And a lot of times it's really close, and it's like, you might be right.
Right.
So we have to be careful with that. And then, if we build trust over time by giving little surveys, and then the employee sees that, oh, they took the survey into account, now they're changing this, or they're talking about this. And this is where that open communication comes from. And we could really do that with, some of the team meetings we have. If you have quarterly meetings, bringing that up. What did the survey say? What are you guys looking into? Keep that transparent. But those are the things I would say, because surveys can be really, really helpful and really rather detrimental if they're not used properly. But I mean, if we're just doing simple question surveys, yeah, they can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I completely agree, right, with the anonymous aspect of surveys. I think that's really important. I think also what feeds into something where, an employee feels like my job might be at stake if I answer this question. It's the phrasing of the question that actually makes such a big difference too. So for an example, if you send out a survey at the end of somebody's shift, and the question stands to be like, what didn't you like about your onboarding process? Or what didn't you like about your shift today? They feel like it's almost, if they send back their honest review, that can be grounds for firing possibly, which I completely resonate with, right? I think that would be very scary to have a response sent back saying, okay, like, I don't want to necessarily stir the pot here. Where if a question stood more like, what would you have liked to see? Or what would you have thought would be better here in this scenario, whatever it might be. And they can give their honest feedback, and they can actually say, oh my gosh, like, my manager took this into consideration, however many, days or weeks or even a month down the road that I sent this survey. I think that's awesome. And as long as it's reflected and taken into account and not necessarily used, obviously, against the employee, I think surveying is awesome. Totally.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Awesome. In terms of, shift workers, we kind of talked about this earlier, Laura, when we were, before the webinar itself. We were talking about skill development and how, there's different levels of knowledge and know-how on different skills within each role. So how can HR actually create training materials that cater to both new hires and even seasoned employees to ensure everyone receives valuable training without feeling overwhelmed or honestly even bored?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put this back to the managers. The HR needs to sit down with the frontline managers and saying, for this job, what trainings would help them?
Sure.
Understanding, because a lot of times we can look at saying, like, for example, we just had an organization, they were doing sales training, and it's a retail organization, and they just deployed like how to approach a customer if it's your second approach. And they did this training, and a couple people were like, yeah, that doesn't work in where we are.
No.
That might work for another department, but not for our department. And I think it's really understanding what tasks they would need to complete something that would be better for them. And I think that's really, really key, is that we're matching up the skill development, and to not only to make that job better, but a future job. Where is their growth? We were talking about this too. The newer generations, well, all generations really, but really the newer generations, they want to know they're being given the skills to grow. No one wants to just be stuck in the same position for 20, 30 years. They want to know that there's growth here and that they're being trained properly in that growth, because if not, they're gonna move on to find another job that's going to give them what they want.
Yeah.
We see this with employee wellness. Employees want to know that their wellness and their well-being is at the forefront. And if the organization can't provide it, they're going to move on. And that's the same thing we see with skills as well.
It feeds me perfectly into this next section that we're going to go into on employee wellness. First and foremost, let me point to this new slide that we've got here. This is a really cool slide, actually. I was really excited about this one. I actually got this from a SHRM white paper, and they had this whole section on IBM's assimilation process and what that even means. So there's 3 steps within this assimilation process: the affirming, beginning, and connecting stage. Affirming is really just defined as occurs prior to a new employee's start date. It includes welcoming the new employee, preparing a workstation, and assigning a coach. Going back to our onboarding buddy, right? Beginning occurs during the employee's first 30 days. During this crucial first month, managers make sure that any resources are available, clarify roles and responsibilities, encourage the newcomer, and schedule quote unquote check-in times to be sure that the new employee is making progress with quote your IBM, which I'm assuming is obviously their branding on their onboarding program here. And then finally, the last stage, and it's really broken down into a couple different mini stages, is the connecting stage. And it occurs during the employee's first year on the job and consists of 3 phases. We could go through those phases together later on. But I think what's really important is one of the most valuable elements of the assimilation process is an individual assigned as a new employee's coach, a friend to answer questions, reinforce concepts, share processes and tools, and help transmit the intangible cultural values of the firm. Laura, what are your thoughts on IBM's assimilation process here? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I love the last one that's underlined,
Yes.
right? Because we can't out tech good personal connection.
Right.
We just can't do it, and I think having those check-ins and, keeping in mind that IBM, they're probably mostly corporate based. While they'll have some plant and factory employees and things like this, this would be really good for a corporate space. It might need to be changed a little bit for a retail space and things like that, depending on what kind of hourly waged employees that we have. Sometimes this is a little bit more difficult, especially with all the touch points and things like that. But if we have a buddy, a coach, a mentor, that makes all of this easier. And I really kind of agree. Being clear on roles and responsibilities. And I feel like a lot of times within the hourly waged employee space, this gets a little muddied
Mm,
because it's not like you're being hired to be customer service and you're answering the phones and you're doing this. It's very clear that role sometimes. I'm going to
yes.
air quote that, right? Um, but a lot of times, if we're a frontline employee, and I'm going to talk about just the retail space, you're answering the phones, you're checking people out, you're helping people find things. There's so much in that. And I think as we onboard, if we can streamline that a little bit better, saying, okay, maybe the first 2 days, this is what I need you to do. This is what the expectations are. And stepping them across the way makes it a little bit easier, depending, of course, on the job, the role, the industry.
Yeah, and this is also, I think you brought up a really good point. This is taking into consideration that theoretically, this employee, the IBM's employee here, is going to be there for at least a year, right? Their employee onboarding program is a year long. And I think that's not realistic, right, for most of the industries that we're talking to today. So the gist of this, I think, is really making sure that the employee feels connected to the culture from day one. So, what would you recommend are some immediate steps that HR can actually make to make sure that their employee feels connected to the culture, from the first day?
I would really put some kind of buddy or coach system in
Yes.
place. And, to your point too, a lot of times hourly wage employees, we're dealing with seasonal employees. We don't
Mhm.
have a year to do this. We don't have 6 months. We have very short time because they might only be there for 2 months or 3 months, depending on what it is. So I think if we can kind of buddy them up to somebody that can show them the ropes quickly,
Yeah.
that would be key. Understanding, even if it's a checklist for the new employee, have you done X? Have you done Y? A lot of times our systems will do this, but we're asking them to learn a new system, learn a new job, learn where things are. It's too much. So sometimes
Mhm.
just handing that old school piece of paper that says, do this,
Yeah.
is a lot easier. So I think sometimes we have to go back a little old school on things,
Mhm.
especially when we're dealing with a very fast paced movement. Now, I will say a lot of times, if we put these connection and touch points in place and we're really focusing on making the onboarding process really easy, streamlined, and comfortable for the new employee, that new employee, if you have a turnover rate of about 3 to 6 months, maybe a lot of times that turnover rate I've seen will increase just based on, accountability, ownership,
Yeah.
things like that. So I think if we start looking at our employees and giving them more accountability and ownership and making them a key part of our team, they're more likely to stay because now they're valued. And that's what an employee wants. They want to feel valued. And if someone's like, hey, I get to show the new people the ropes and they're really good at their job and they're welcoming, that's a really good way to have someone buy into your organization.
Absolutely. So, how, can HR and even management teams, right, be able to gauge and measure actual employee engagement, and honestly, even use that to identify potential issues and address them head on? How can they do that?
It really comes down to some really good written surveys and
Mhm.
some touch points with managers.
Yeah.
And having the manager's ear on the ground. A lot of times our managers might be stuck in a back office and they're not hearing what's happening other than, oh, the employees are all cranky. No, why are they cranky? What is happening? What's going on? Your employees shouldn't be cranky. If your employees are cranky, there is something going wrong. Maybe it's your hiring process, but maybe it's the management. Maybe there's one bad employee in the mix. We really need to kind of understand that. And the only way for us to really understand that is to be in the mix and really talking with those employees.
Absolutely. So, do you have any examples, on companies that actually have successfully implemented these engagement strategies and, seen a reduction in turnover at the end of the day? And what are the elements that actually contributed to that success?
So, there's always one that comes to mind for me in the forefront, and it was a transportation company, and they really put a lot of focus on employee wellness and well-being. They've
Yeah.
had a lot of employee burnout, a lot of employee turnover. They weren't the highest paid, so that only led to more, right? And what they did is they really kind of focused on the employee wellness. They were allowing them to have coaches that came in. I was actually one of the coaches that came in. We were coaching the employees. They were doing different events. They were having, different things going on. Their meetings, they were putting in healthy foods and things like that. And actually we saw people that were going to retire actually hold off on their retirement.
Wow.
And one lady actually brought her daughter into the organization
Wow.
because she felt like, hey, this company, they're now valuing me. And, this would be a great place for my daughter. And might I add, no change was done in the employee's pay. So it
Wow.
wasn't like they gave increases and it
That's
was like, yeah,
incredible.
they just focused on the employees' health and well-being. And really, as we're talking about the millennials and the Gen Zs, health is really big at the top of their list. They
Mhm.
don't want to be burned out like their parents were or their
Right.
grandparents were. They want to make sure that they can have that healthy work-life balance because we
Mhm.
saw it with the Great Resignation. How many people said it's not worth it?
Absolutely. It's so true. And for those who are curious on the work-life balance principles and solutions that we can actually help our, employees achieve that work-life balance, Laura and I have an awesome webinar on the site on, managing mental health in the workplace and what that looks like. Be sure to go check it out on the site. Laura, to close out before we do start with our Q&A section, what are one or two top tips, actions, or takeaways that our audience can leave with to, better onboard their employees?
Yeah. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to pick 3 employees today, and I want you to ask them if
I
they
love it.
know where oh geez, that just left my brain, where their employee handbook is.
Yeah.
Ask them where they know, because this is a key thing. If they can't find the employee handbook, that's one big question for a lot of them.
Yeah.
And that just tells you that they don't know where certain things are, especially the most important things, right? I
Absolutely.
want to do that. And then the next thing is see how you can integrate a buddy system, mentorship, coaching. Maybe it's even just having a talk with your managers, your leaders, your directors, anybody on how this can be implemented, because you're seeing it from IBM. I've seen it firsthand in the field. Having that buddy system, that mentorship works. There's a reason why skilled trades use journeyman and mentorship to bring people into the field. It works. It has
Yeah.
solid research behind it. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I actually just dropped a link in the chat with our onboarding feature. For those of you who do want to check it out, I know I got some messages to me directly, so I figured I'd throw it out. It's a really awesome feature to get employees onboarded in less than 3 minutes, which is huge. So feel free to check it out if you have any questions there. I would love to hop into, again, this Q&A section. We do have a couple emailed in questions for those who are wanting to ask a question. Throw it in the chat. We would love to get to you. Rosalind, I'm going to shout you out. Thank you for emphasizing on hourly employees. It seems like most trainings are for corporate and salary employees, but I have an added layer. My employees are immigrants and don't speak English. I don't see any trainings for HR in this area. Actually, I would love to open the discussion. Laura, first and foremost, let's talk about Rosalind's point. I think that's a really great point, Rosalind. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's important.
This is a really strong point, and I'm really glad to see this got added in. What we need to do in this situation is we really kind of need to work with HR. So Rosalind, I would really kind of work with your HR team and think, how can we do this better? The first thing that comes to mind, it is, again, I'm going to go back to that mentorship kind of idea. First of all, if you're having most people joining your teams and they don't speak English, you have to translate the documentation. It has to be translated. So I think that's key in this, that stuff is all translated. The next thing I would also add to is find somebody that can cross over the language barriers and put them with the onboarding. Make them part of that onboarding staff, because that's going to be key. And really kind of having that communication, because one of the craziest things is there could be such a large language barrier, but empathy and just humanity can really kind of come through this. So I think we really need to kind of work with what we have, because it's a difficult situation.
Mm.
Um, but I know we can do better.
Yeah, definitely. And again, Rosalind, I think that's awesome. We do translation and have a bilingual HR. I think that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Elizabeth said we find buddies who can speak the language to help new employees. That's awesome. I think that's really good. And again, Elizabeth, even earlier, you said our buddies are currently being trained. I think that's so great. And I'm so happy to hear that this webinar was timely because I think that you're not alone, right? There's been a really big divide within the HR and manager operation space because onboarding has been such a problem and nobody really knows where things lie anymore in a post-COVID world. I think that's awesome that it was timely. So thank you guys for sharing. If you have any other questions, guys, feel free to throw them in the chat. We have a couple more minutes here. I am going to get to our emailed in questions first and
Real
foremost.
quick, I just want to go
Please.
back to Rosalind's thing there for a minute.
Absolutely.
We've had so much D&I training, right? This is at the forefront of this.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to say is everybody that has a cell phone has Google Translate. If you have a hard time communicating with somebody else at work, get Google Translate.
Yeah.
It is everyone's cell phone is generally in their pocket. Speak to it and allow it to help you out because we really need to support everybody here, and we have so much technology that can help us, so let's utilize it.
Yep. That's at 60%. Definitely. Awesome. Tyreek asked, he emailed in a question. I work as a franchise GM of a hotel business. Our upper management believes that there should be way more done when it comes to our onboarding process, but I believe less is more. Am I wrong here? If not, how can I prove to management that our staff doesn't require a week-long onboarding process?
This is a difficult one, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes less is more and sometimes it's not. We also don't
Right.
want to put our employees' feet to the fire. We want to
Right.
make sure that they're prepared. What I would say is look at your onboarding process, understand what is required, what is not. So if you're going to go to upper management and say, I want to fight this, you better have a very good, clear standpoint of what they need and what they don't need and how it can streamline it. Because, I used to have a director that told me, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with the solution. So if you're saying this onboarding process is too long, this is stuff we don't need, lay it out. Why don't they need it? How does that not affect their job and their ability to do the job? And maybe they do need it. Maybe we could just push it off till next week. Maybe we could do that 30, 60, 90 days onboarding
Yeah.
and things like that. So that's what I would say with that.
And I think there's a couple thoughts I have here. One, I do believe that, short is great. It saves a lot of time. I think that's awesome. But at the same time, circling back with the employee again, opening up that communication channel and saying, is there anything else that I can go more into? Was there anything I wasn't clear about? Diving into more of the niche topics that employee specifically needs or is looking for. And again, the only issue I have with this approach that I'm even thinking conjuring up as we speak is the employee might be too nervous. It's their first day. They don't want to say, oh yeah, I was really confused when you were talking about the employee handbook. They're probably not going to put their necks out on the line like that. So it's a balance, but at the same time, I do think that there's a way to kind of bridge that gap, Tyreek, in the sense of, hey, making sure that we're remaining short, concise, and, to the point with a lot of these onboarding training programs, protocols. And I think that's great. But at the same time, making sure that, hey, we're communicating with them. We're consistently following up saying that makes sense. Is there something you want me to go more into? Anything like that. And I think that's absolutely huge. And again, even maybe reserving that 90th check-in, the 90-day check-in, to make sure, hey, is there anything that I could have recapped a little bit better, and actually garnering that face-to-face feedback? I think that would be really cool. Bridget K asked, there's no consistency amongst our 15 managers we have across all of our locations. It creates a weird divide between stores, as some managers are great on onboarding, account to feedback, and others aren't. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a manager problem, right?
Yeah.
You need to have some direction. It's kind of like finding that balance. What direction is too much and what is not enough? The other thing I would say with this is one store a lot bigger than the other one? There's a lot of questions in here, right?
Yeah.
But what I would say is it really comes down to management. We need to make sure we are hiring effective managers. And I know a lot of times, things get busy. We just try to put bodies in jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be an issue. So what something like this, I would say, what are, what's missing from the ones that aren't onboarding, what's working, what's not, and come together. It might be about bringing all the managers together, maybe on a day that they can get off or through a Zoom, and saying, what's your process look like? What's your process look like? What's your process look like? What's working? What's not? Let's come up with a process that we can be consistent across the board, especially if we're swapping employees between stores. This is big because, again, when we're looking at employee well-being, they might do great in one, location, but the next location, it's a hot mess.
Yeah.
We need to be consistent when it comes to our employees. So it's really, SOPs, right? We need an SOP for onboarding. And sometimes when we're
Absolutely.
dealing with smaller retailers, we don't have it. But I'm a big person. If you have any business, I don't care if it's a one-person business, you need an SOP.
Mm. We have time for one more question as we are coming up on that hour mark. Nancy, in the final minute, said, how do we encourage managers to produce a great onboarding when some hourly positions are so high turnover?
Oh, there. So with something like this, I would want to know why we have such high turnover.
Mm,
Is it pay? Is it poor management? I think we need to look. Is it just the nature of the job? If it's just the nature of the job, I would probably look at a buddy system. Probably
yeah.
wouldn't even go as much as a mentor or a coach, just a buddy system. Somebody that's really good at bringing people in and understanding it. So I think with stuff like that, we have to look. But anytime someone tells me there's high turnover, that's like a red flag. I want to know why we're having such high turnover. And most of the time I've seen it because of poor leadership,
Mm.
or it's been poor interviewing. Like the interviewing, just
Oh, yeah.
they need better interviewing skills to really be able to weed out.
I think that's a really good point. Kind of getting to the root of the issue and going all the way back to that first conversation you have with a possible new hire, right? I think that's huge. Interviewing is, we can do a whole nother interview or a whole nother webinar on just interviews and conducting them.
Let me know.
Yeah, really, honestly. It actually feeds me into my last point I do want to make. I asked a poll question on what webinar topics you guys might be interested in. I'll select all that apply. And a lot of people are saying employee retention. We actually have one coming up on October 19th on how to design a retention strategy for hourly staff. We have an awesome guest. We have Margaret Jackson of RPM Pizza. She is a senior director of training and development. So she is coming on to share some amazing insights on that. So feel free to click on that link and register to join. I do also want to quickly hand out Laura's awesome handout that she shared on happier and healthier workforce strategies, those top 10 tips. Guys, check this out. This is an awesome PDF. Laura, thank you so much for coming on. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time.